Okay, can we move to my favorite? I want to end up with the Jesuits. I spent 35 years with them. Ignatius Loyola. You know, I spent a lot of time preparing for today, last night, and I realized in this last couple of months that what I'm doing here today and yet last night with you is to pull it together, to cull together the things that I've written about and taught about that I love most through my life. And it's been an amazing, wonderful trip to pull these pieces together. And Ignatius is a very important part of that. So I can conclude on a note of real desire. But once again, let's begin with another mystic as a teaser. Julian of Norwich this time, the 14th century English solitary who received visions in which God disclosed the utter depths of God's love for her and for us. She knew her visions didn't come just for her, but for everybody else. And God said to her in one of her visions, "I am he who makes you to long. I am he, the endless fulfilling of all true desires." Julian has been, along with Richard Rohr, one of the most important teachers of mine in the last 15, 20 years. She saw in her visions that there's a couple of nights when she's on a deathbed, it seems, that contrary to what she'd always thought, God is not filled with judgment as God looks at our sins. She instead is overwhelmed by God's love. In fact, she goes so far as to say that from her perspective of what God is teaching her in these visions, sin is necessary. We wouldn't grasp the extent of God's love and forgiveness if we hadn't sinned. Admittedly, as awful as it can be, disrupting relationships in our lives, from God's point of view, it doesn't define us. In the end, it's God's love that endures. And that's how she knows that all will be well and all manner of things will be well. It's within that context that she speaks those famous words. In fact, I love this. She argues that in heaven, we won't be embarrassed by the memory of our sins. Instead, we'll wear them as a badge, knowing that that's what got us there. Not our good works, but our having sinned and been forgiven. What more, she asked, can stir your desire for God than that? So with this reminder of love, let's move to our final teacher of desire today, Saint Ignatius Loyola. Whoops. He discovered God's love, curiously enough, in a dark cave when he was struggling with depression at an important time in his life. Ignatian spirituality has been profoundly important for me in all the dark places of my life as well. So let's begin with a story about caves. The Yaqui Indians in the Sonoran Desert of southern Arizona tell of a sacred cave on the slopes of the Red Mountain, Sicklekawi. It's hard to find this mythical place. The opening is no bigger than a small fox den. You have to squeeze yourself into a narrow passageway between the rocks, moving into the darkness. As you get further in, you sit down on a log to rest, but the log turns into a snake and it wraps itself around you. Wherever you look, wild animals move in the shadows, old memories of things you have feared all of your life. But if you show no terror, an old man leads you into an inner cavern where any talent, any gift you might ever have desired can be seen hanging from the walls. You can choose whatever it is you want. Maybe it's the gift of being a writer or a storyteller. the talent of playing the flute or carving masks, the art of training horses, or being able to make yourself invisible. You only have to know what you want. And even that knowledge can grow out of the darkness there. Now, when you leave, you pass by a pit full of rattlesnakes. And in that moment, if you yield to your fear, if you try to deny the frightening and broken places in your life, your fear will change you in one of the animals you'd seen in the cave. But if you get back to the world again, and there's never any real promise of that, if you carry with you the fearlessness that you found along with a gift that you chose, then you will have the freedom to practice that gift all the rest of your life with fullness. According to Yaqui wisdom, appropriating your gift is a matter of handling your terror. Isn't that something? Now, in Scripture, a cave in the ground is often a place where death is encountered and overcome, where fears are faced and put to rest. You have Elijah fleeing from Jezebel to the cave on Mount Horeb, where he hears the still small voice of God and recovers his courage. Jesus stands before the cave tomb where Lazarus, his dear friend, had been buried. He shouts, "Lazarus, come forth," and Mary and Martha's fears are transformed forever. Moses hides in the cave, the cleft of the rock, the only safe place where he could see God passing by without dying of the shock of such glory. 5 years ago, I went backpacking in southern Missouri in an area known for its karst geography, filled with limestone caves. There are over 6,400 caves in the state of Missouri, with folk tales of giant cave bears lurking inside, moonshiners making illegal whiskey, bandit gangs like Jesse James and the Dalton brothers. I spent a night alone in one of those caves down in Ripley County near the Arkansas line, a winding limestone passageway that burrows into the mountainside. I wasn't doing anything technical like speleologists or cave scientists sometimes do, yet I'd gone prepared for the experience, or so I thought. I had the required 3 sources of light that you need for caving: a helmet, knee pads, clothing to keep me warm and dry. I was careful to avoid any side passages where I might get lost and to keep my head down as I crawled through narrow places. This cave goes back some 3,000 feet and continues in an underwater passage even beyond that. Scuba divers are still exploring how far back it really goes. I went in about 1,000 feet, far enough so I couldn't see my hand in front of my face. And I spent the night there, alone in the dark. I had misgivings about a night alone in a space 5 to 7 feet high, 6 to 10 feet wide, and a quarter of a mile in. But I was taking a lot of inner baggage with me at the time, struggling with my faith once again, coming to terms with this enigmatic figure of Jesus who had haunted me all of my life. Going underground in complete darkness is probably the last place you want to go when you're struggling or wrestling with God. Now, this particular cave had been carved out by an underground spring-fed stream, so the sound of moving water echoed down the corridors like distant voices, water dripping everywhere. There were stalactites hanging down from the ceiling and stalagmites reaching up from the floor. There were blind cave fish swimming in the clear water, albino salamanders you could see through, bats clinging to the roof. The complete absence of light in a cave, as many of you know, is unsettling. when you're taken as a tourist down into a cave and they turn the flashlight off. You've been there. It's uncanny. Darkness has a life of its own. One experienced Missouri caver put it this way: it's not unlike a black liquid. Darkness has a life of its own. It stalks you. It crawls and creeps around you as you move. At every opportunity, it seems to sweep up and cling to your back. I'm glad I didn't read that before going. Now, caves have always fascinated us in science and in mythic tales alike. They're places where frightening things lurk and places where we might hide from frightening things. They come in all shapes and sizes. Solution caves, like the one where I camped, are formed by water cutting its way through limestone rock. Mammoth Cave in Kentucky is the best example of this. It's the longest cave in the world, with 360 miles of mapped passages, winding 5 levels deep into the earth. Just astounding. And then there are sea caves carved out by ocean waves on the Pacific coast. There are lava tube caves formed by flowing volcanic lava in Hawaii and California, and even glacier caves made of ice in Alaska and Iceland. Part of the mystery of caves is that they take us back into deep time. At Lascaux in southern France, archaeologists have found Paleolithic cave paintings of mysterious horses and stags over 17,000 years old. But Gabernmung Cave in Australia's Northern Territory has paintings over 35,000 years old. It has a virtual Sistine Chapel ceiling covered with images of crocodiles, kangaroos, and other sacred figures from the dream time of creation. In some cultural traditions, caves play an important role in creation stories. The Hopi Indians in Arizona speak of the first people as having emerged from underground, from a hole in the roof of the underworld. Their kivas are cave-like places dug into the earth for conducting sacred rituals. And in each of these kivas, there's a hole in the very center of the dirt floor. It's called the sipapu, and it symbolizes the original place of emergence, where the first peoples came from the underworld. Plato spoke of the cave as a place of darkness where we are chained, longing for the light. Benedict lived in a cave for 3 years in the mountains south of Rome before organizing his monastic community. Muhammad, in a cave on Mount Hira, heard the voice of the angel Gabriel reciting the words of the Holy Quran. The cave is a place of illumination where new wisdom emerges. It's a portal between worlds. Bilbo Baggins went into the cave to find the dragon's hidden treasure. Now, Ignatius Loyola, the founder of the Jesuits, the Society of Jesus, had a formative cave experience at a significant turning point in his life. He was born in 1491 in northern Spain to a family of the Basque nobility. The Basques have a long history of pride in their distinctive language and culture. They claim, in fact, that Basque was the first language spoken by Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. The devil himself studied it for 7 years and never learned more than 3 words. As a teenager, Ignatius's father sent him to the royal court, where he flourished as a promising young knight. His friends called him Inigo. They loved him for his wit and reckless exuberance. He had an eye for the ladies and a readiness to fight at the drop of a hat. When the French invaded the nearby town of Pamplona in 1521, he sprang to its defense, rallying his men atop the walls, but he was wounded by cannon fire that completely shattered one of his legs. He would walk with a serious limp for the rest of his life. While recovering from multiple surgeries, he read the lives of the saints, and he experienced a dramatic conversion. He decided to become a soldier for Christ and to begin his new quest by making a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. He got as far as the little town of Manresa near Barcelona on the coast. But that's where everything fell apart. He passed through a dark night of the soul, staying there for almost a year, living in a cave for part of that time, and starting to write his spiritual exercises. It was a limestone cave near the river Cardener, just outside the village. And from its opening, he could see the sawtooth ridge of Montserrat 10 miles away. That's where he had stopped on his way there, leaving his sword and dagger behind him, praying all night at the Mary altar of the Benedictine monastery there. And here at Manresa, the three archetypal symbols of the mountain, the river, and the cave came together for him. He had always aspired for the mountain heights, striving to be the most impressive knight at court, the bravest soldier, and now he had thought he was going to be the best of all the saints. But he quickly realized that he had to come down the mountain and into the cave. He had to face the river's work in carving out the canyon of his inner life. His 3 months in the cave at Manresa would be the hardest period of his life, undercutting the bedrock of everything he had known. But it's also a time for the birthing of something altogether new. He experiences a breakdown there, psychologically, physically, spiritually, passing through thorns and thistles along the riverbank as he goes in and out of his dark cave. For the first time in his life, he finds himself without an admiring audience, with no one to impress by his reputation, falling into a deep depression over the hollowness of what his life had been and uncertainty as to whatever might come next. He feared that God could never forgive him for all of his past sins. He was tempted even to commit suicide, throwing himself into a crevice deep within the cave. He had reached bottom. That place where I've said where 12-step program people know well. But then Inigo's experiences a breakthrough into something new. He'd always been a man given to his senses. Beautiful women, fine clothes, the taste of good wine, the thrill of hand-to-hand fighting. And it's curious that God now speaks to him through the sensory impact of the surrounding landscape. He has several visions during this time there, and the most vivid one, what he describes later as the single most powerful experience of his whole life. It comes as he sits by the river near the mouth of the cave, looking out onto the mountains. He's suddenly aware of being surrounded by beauty. The eyes of his open understanding begin to open, he said. He perceives the whole of creation in a new light, seeing God in all things. That's a central theme that he would develop all the rest of his life. He moves through several layers of wonder that he finds in the natural world that come to him in this visionary experience. He enters into the depths of foundational elements like rock and water. He's swept away by the scintillating brilliance and greenness of plants around him. He marvels at the sensate feeling of animals, their keen sense of smell, hearing, and seeing, and he's blown away by his own expanded consciousness as he takes all this in. You'd think he'd been eating sacred mushrooms or something, but he wasn't. He's led into an awareness of himself as a dwelling place of the Most High God, a God of cosmic wonder, holding everything together in love. And about this time, he receives a vision of Jesus as well, seeing him in all of his humanity, as he said. His encounter of God is anchored always in this worldly sensory experience, in God become flesh. It's not abstract ideas about Jesus that impress him. It's specific and earthy images of a God alive in this world. And so he wants to continue to go to Jerusalem so he can touch and see the actual places where this man had lived, this one who now had captured his heart. It's in this world, in his own sensory experience, in his own body, that he finds an answer to his longing. These two visions give rise to two central themes in Ignatian spirituality. The glory of God as perceived in the world around us, revealed in the cosmic Christ, everything tending to the greater glory of God. That's a continuing theme in Ignatian spirituality. Ad majorem Dei gloriam, to the greater glory of God. And not only the glory of God, but the vulnerability of God, as perceived in the death of Jesus on the cross, revealed in the crucified Lord. Here, God reveals unconditional love in the face of brutal power. And these are the two chief ways by which God discloses God's innermost heart. This is what God is like, says Ignatius. God is the majesty of love that holds the world together, moving it toward a deeper consciousness of its source. And God is the humility of love that enters into an egocentric world intoxicated by power. God coming as one of the powerless so as to bring change from below. God is there in both, in the vast wonder of creation and in the broken body of Christ. Ignatius put it this way: being God isn't confined to greatness. It's being contained in the smallest of things. So there in the cave, Jesus becomes the core reality of his life. And out of this, a new fearlessness emerges, a new courage based not on Basque machismo and romantic chivalry, but on his confidence that the world is filled with God's glory and that it dwells in him as well. It gives him a new energy. He becomes a warrior of compassion, founding the company of Jesus, the Jesuit community. And it's not accidental that the cave is the place where he starts to write the spiritual exercises. That's his most important legacy. Have some of you been through the Ignatian exercises? Wonderful, wonderful. It's a life-changing experience. These are explicit directions for companioning others on the spiritual life, ideally over 30 days, that would be given to prayer and reflection. He organizes the exercises into 4 weeks or 4 movements in the spiritual life. In the first week, you're taken through a time of purgation and release, acknowledging the broken, wounded places inside. It's what Ignatius had encountered himself in the cave. And this leads you, in the second week, to a decision-making point in your life, when you choose between 2 standards, deciding who it is you will serve, what choices you have to make right now in your life. Often the exercises are encouraged for people who are on the verge of having to make an important decision in their lives. And then in weeks 3 and 4, You're carried into an intensive, deeply sensuous reading of the gospel stories of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. And through each step of the exercises, Ignatius keeps asking you this question: what desire is welling up within you as you move through all of these stages, movements? What do you find yourself wanting to ask of God? Again and again, he has the retreatant asked, what do you desire? What do you want? What's rising in you? He knows that our desires are one of God's primary ways of communicating with us. He argues, in fact, that our deepest desires are God's desires. But you got to be able to discern your truest longings from the lesser cravings that'll always sidetrack us. But you can trust the deepest desires of your heart. Now, he's aware that not all of us start out feeling any deep desire for God. Maybe whatever. Compared to the saints, we feel hollow inside, and we feel guilty about that. So he says, Ignatius says, don't worry about what may or may not be coming alive inside you. If all you got is a desire for the desire, that's good enough. Just begin there. Ignatius is wonderfully perceptive and down to earth. Now, again, let's pause here for a minute. I want you to think about what's been welling up in you all through today and last night. I want you to take a little time to work on a wish list that you find on your handout sheet. It has 3 categories in it. The first is what you already have but just need to act on. The second is what you find yourself wanting but haven't reached for yet. And the third is what you kind of wish for but only have a desire for the desire. For example, in list number 1, you might say, well, you know, I have that book back on the shelf at home, that book by Thomas Merton, or that book of poetry by Mary Oliver, or even the Bible. I just need to pick it up and read it again. Or I do have access to that cabin up in the woods that I could use as a retreat anytime that I want. Why don't I make use of what I already got? That's the first question to deal with. And in the second list, you might think, you know, I'm intrigued by what he said about spiritual direction this weekend. And heard a lot of people seeking out a director, and that might be something I'd be interested in. Or Celtic spirituality is something that always has fascinated me. Having been to Ireland, I just love it. And maybe I ought to read more of that, John Philip Newell or someone else. Some great things that are out there. Things that you want to commit to that you know you want, but you haven't reached for yet. And then in list number 3, and this might be the most important of all, you might put, to be honest, I've never in my life really set aside a time for daily silence and meditation. Obviously, I don't want it bad enough, but I want to want it, you know? Or even more honestly, maybe you might say, this stuff is hard for me to relate to, but I'm willing to make a stretch. If nothing else, I'm ready to commit to spending a day in the Cascades or the Olympics just to see what might wake up inside me. So this would be a stretch question to deal with. What reaching for, what you only have the desire for the desire. We will not share this with anybody else, either verbally or otherwise. So I'd invite you to spend some time thinking through these. You can write if you like on your sheet. And as you do so, want to listen to wonderful ukulele music by that Israel, I can't pronounce his last name, from Hawaii, wonderful man, singing about this wonderful world and the dreams that we might imagine over the rainbow. Let's work on our desires. Okay. There may be more work for you to do on this. Take it home with you. Pray over it. Give yourself time with it. What's your desire? What's the deepest longing of your heart? Now, in closing, I'd like to go back to Ignatius's cave experience so as to share how it was helpful in my experience of going into that cave in southern Missouri. As I prepared for the trip, I was uneasy. I didn't know why I was so afraid of going into the dark of the cave alone. I'd been in caves before, and I hadn't felt the fear that I felt in anticipation for any of the other trips I'd done. But then I realized I was still wrestling with Jesus. As I said, I had grown up in a fundamentalist background in the South and had struggled with Jesus for a long time. I'd been taught to love him, but I also had learned to fear him as well. Through my years of teaching and writing on nature and spirituality, I'd learned to delight in the cosmic Christ, the Lord of the universe, holding everything together in love. But Jesus was more of a problem. The Jesus of my childhood didn't seem necessarily to approve of my love of nature. I'd been told he was coming back to take Christians away from this sinful world. We sang a gospel song, "This world is not my home, I'm just a passing through. My treasures are laid up somewhere beyond the blue." And I knew God was angry at sinners. He was coming back in the rapture to save only the true believers, like the people in my home church who had been born again, who'd had a conversion experience of a particular sort that I had never had. I couldn't point to a particular time when I'd been saved that I can write in the front pages of my Schofield Reference Bible. I was left with all kinds of doubts about how Jesus could be trusted, how Jesus could be God. And oddly enough, it was a tree that was able to point me again to the Jesus I'd wanted all along, the Jesus I'd found in Ignatius. The night before I left on the trip, this trip into the cave, I went over to see grandfather, carrying all of this baggage with me. And as I leaned into him, I heard him saying to me as clear as day, "You know, Belden, there's nothing you have to be afraid of in going into the dark of that cave tomorrow. Who have you been meeting every night all these years and coming over to be with me, if not Jesus? You stand in the wound of his side every night. My bark, his flesh, same difference." I heard the tree saying, "I'm just like Jesus, you know, wounded and showing love to those who come to me broken like you." Here, an old tree who was in love with me was showing me Jesus. And suddenly the cosmic Christ and the Jesus of the cross came together for me, the universal and the particular. What holds everything together in cosmic unity and what suffers out of love with every individual part. The two are inseparable. This is the Jesus Ignatius had experienced, alive in everything, everyone. And grandfather went on that night to say something still more astounding to me. He said, "You know what's even more outrageous than my showing you Jesus? It's not your doubts about whether Jesus was divine. It's the question, if you can imagine this, Belden, whether you are divine as well. Just like me, like all of us, reflecting God's image. The Holy made real in every one of us, all to the greater glory of God. Ad maiorem Dei gloriam." That's what I heard the tree saying. And the next day, as I walked into the cave, I went without any fear whatever, realizing that the Jesus I'd wanted most of all had been inside in me all along. Now, grandfather, without knowing it or articulating it in his mind, was reaching into a very old, deep Christian tradition in theology, especially in the Eastern Church, about what Christian mystics refer to as the mystery of theosis. Our becoming divine, entering fully into the image and likeness of God. We read in 2 Peter 1:4 that our destiny is to become partakers of the divine nature, being in-godded, as it were, transfigured with Christ into the very image of God, able to say with Paul that it is no longer I, but Christ who lives in me. How do we ever grasp such a wonder? Jean Houston is an archetypal psychologist who in some of her workshops has used an exercise she calls, "Are you God in hiding?" She works with 100 people or more in a large, dimly lit ballroom, asking them to close their eyes and wander slowly around the room. And whenever they run into someone, they are to ask softly, "Are you God in hiding?" And the other person responds just as softly, asking the same question, "Are you God in hiding?" And they keep going on to more and more people asking the same question. Now, Jean previously has assigned the role of God to one individual in the group. And when you run into that person asking, "Are you God in hiding?" you get no response. He or she is silent. And by their silence, you become God as well. It's a signal for you to remain silent too when other people come up to you saying, are you God in hiding? Gradually, a stillness spreads across the entire room. She says it never takes more than a few minutes for more than 100 people to come to complete silence in awe at the fact that God is there in every one of them. Can you imagine waking up tomorrow morning, looking at yourself in the mirror and asking, "Are you God in hiding?" and answering only with silence and a smile? I tell you, accepting the reality of this truth will change your life. What happens when you know you already have your heart's desire? What happens when you realize that you are what you always wanted to be? You just need to live into it. What happens when it dawns on you that the treasure is at home all along? It sinks into you that you are glorious, a beloved son or God or daughter of God, like every other creature on this tattered but beautiful earth. And you're here to make everything else glorious too. That's when your desire turns into an incredible strength and courage. You're free to reach out beyond yourself to a world crying out to be loved. You're free to move and speak now with a new fearlessness. Fear is gone once love takes over. You've learned to walk in the dark, as Barbara Brown Taylor would say. You're free from the crippling fear that characterizes so much of our world today, causing us to hunker down against all the perceived threats to our safety. You're free to resist the fear mongers in high places who tempt us to panic before the encroaching forces of darkness, making us afraid of those who are different from us, white, straight, Western Christians, fearful of those who are different, who are said to be dangerous and can't be loved. Fear, said Gandhi, is the greatest danger in the world today. A fear stirred by misinformation and lies. And yet, in the end, it will not triumph over love. Those who know to whom they belong are emboldened to love and to act out of the God-filled compassion that is their deepest being. Can you imagine people like that? You know some of them. You are some of them. Over the last 15 or 20 years, I've been working with men, helping to lead retreats and men's rites of passage in wilderness settings. And this grows out of Richard Rohr's work in helping men to move into the second half of life, beyond the quest for power and success that had marked their earlier experience, into the wisdom and compassion of elders. God knows we don't have enough men or women like that. The elders invite us to cut against the grain of our culture, to be bold in the exercise of love. They don't worry anymore about what other people think. These old men and fiery women aren't intimidated by anything. They are gloriously free. But they also know that for their work to be effective in the world, it has to grow out of what's inside, what motivates them from the inside out. They realize they have to stay connected to that dark, hidden place of the heart. That's where love wants to keep bursting forth. So at their best, they stay rooted in a contemplative practice, entering regularly into the cave of themselves, being alone with God. That's where they keep being reminded who they are. You won't be any good in the world without being deeply connected to your soul work. Barbara Brown Taylor makes a fascinating distinction, by the way, between pastoral counseling and spiritual direction. We go to counselors, she says, when we want help getting out of caves. We go to directors when we're ready to be led farther in. Isn't that wonderful? Spiritual direction wants to take you further into the cave of the heart. Now, our frantic culture tells us to be terrified of the dark places, weary of the silence and solitude of the cave. It's better to stay busy, keep the lights on, turn up the music, pretend we have all the answers. We are deathly afraid of going inside, being alone with ourselves and with God. Think about maybe even your own resistance to time in the dark, still place where you go to be quiet. When was the last time you spent 24 hours alone and in silence in a small room, a hermitage somewhere, a cabin in the woods, a tent along a trail? One of the best things any of us can do is to maintain a personal cave to which we regularly retreat. A prayer closet, a Christ room that you've set aside. The Russian Orthodox call it a pustynia, an intentional desert place into which you withdraw. For me, it's the cavity in grandfather's side every night. He is the cave of contemplative practice into which I retreat, where grandfather reminds me again and again who I am and to whom I belong. And strangely enough, this cave gives birth over and over again to a stunning freedom. On leaving, we walk through the world like Jesus, with leaves in his hair, laughter on his lips, and a prophetic voice speaking truth to power. We take our stand with the earth's wider community, with the poor, with everything that needs to be loved. May it be so. There's Ellie. Let me end with a story that comes out of the savannas of East Africa. These San Bushmen who live in the Serengeti Desert of Tanzania know that the lions of the Serengeti love to hunt the gazelle as their favorite prey. But the gazelle are fast, and the lions aren't always fast enough to catch them. So what the lions often do is to divide themselves into two groups. They have the old lions lie down in high grass while the younger ones circle around behind the gazelle and start them running in the direction of the old ones hiding in the bush. Now, the old lions, of course, aren't very fast and they pose very little threat to the gazelle, but they can roar like hell. There are some things that old farts are still good for. So when the old lions see the gazelle running toward them, they wait for just the right moment, and then suddenly they stand up and roar for all that they're worth. And the gazelle, startled by this new and unexpected threat, follow their instinct, of course, to stop and freeze, and then they run in the opposite direction away from what they fear, and in the process, obviously, they run right into the young lions coming behind them. The irony is that if they had simply kept running into their fear instead of away from it, they would have escaped. The old lions, after all, couldn't do much more than roar. Like the gazelle, our impulse in the dark cave-like times of our lives is to freeze in the face of fear and to run the other way, imagining that we too are helpless in the presence of paralyzing terror. But the elders want to remind us that we don't have to freeze like animals caught in the headlights. We are set free to act and to choose, to move, as Ignatius would say, from contemplation into action, from fear into love. That's the core of Ignatian spirituality, after all. A life of prayer leading to authentic change in the world. And God knows today, in the face of overpowering fear, we need more voices for peace, more ears to hear the earth cry for sustainability, and more hearts open to the plight of dying rainforests and displaced people everywhere. Our work for justice and peace is a natural outcome of any authentic spirituality. So on this Earth Day weekend, my friends, the Spirit of God summons us to a fearless and joyous celebration of a world shot through with God's glory. May it overwhelm us and free us to be the love of Christ in the world. Amen. Amen. We're in good shape. We close with a poem by Mary Oliver, Wild Geese. Many of you know it and love it. You do not have to be good. You do not have to walk on your knees for 100 miles through the desert repenting. You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. Tell me about despair, yours, and I will tell you mine. Meanwhile, the world goes on. Meanwhile, the sun and the clear pebbles of the rain are moving across the landscapes, over the prairies and the deep trees, the mountains and the rivers. Meanwhile, the wild geese high in the clean blue air are heading home again. Whoever you are, no matter how lonely, the world offers itself to your imagination, calls you like the wild geese, harsh and exciting, over and over, announcing your place in the family of things. Amen.